Welcome to Law Syrup, the show where we talk with special guests about hot topics in Canadian law. This podcast is a co-production with the Ontario Justice Education Network, also known as OJEN. I'm your host, Herman Wong. Let's tap in. Before we begin, please know that this show is not intended to be legal advice or a replacement for a legal representative. Welcome back to another episode, everybody. Today we've got another great panel discussion for you. I was very lucky to be joined by Luís Filipe, Matthew Wilks, and Marija Apostolovski, each of whom are high school law teachers. Now, I am someone who was first introduced to law by taking it as a course in grade 11. And as you'll hear in today's episode, taking that class set me on the path to where I am today. I was then really interested to see how high school law teachers today are motivating students to become more curious and more engaged with the law, which is also what we strive for with this show. I also wanted to see how they navigate teaching sensitive topics and also what advice they might have for other high school law teachers. So here's my conversation with Luís, Matt, and Marija. All right, so now we've got everybody here. How about we all introduce ourselves and tell us where you went to high school? Marija, how about you go first?
Sure. So my name's Marija. I went to high school in Durham Region, graduated from J. Clark Richardson. So I was actually part of the first cohort to complete all 4 years at that school. And currently I'm a secondary high school teacher, but I've been seconded to a central position right now. So I'm a K-12 curriculum facilitator supporting various subject areas, including law.
Amazing. And Matt, how about you?
Hi, everyone. So I'm Matt Wilks. I am a secondary school teacher at a school called Garth Webb Secondary School in Oakville. And I went to Pierre Elliott Trudeau High School in Markham, which I understand, Herman, is where you also went to high school.
It is, and I was very surprised when I found out that you were also a PET alumni. I think I literally just looked through your LinkedIn and I was like, oh my gosh, we went to the same high school together. So that's fun.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I've found that there have been a lot of people, at least from Trudeau, that have gone into law. And I can think in terms of my cohort, a number of people from my law class when I took grade 12 law later went on to become lawyers. So it was a wonderful school. Really enjoyed the experience.
Yeah, I love the school. I love taking law in high school there. It was amazing. Now, Luís, how about you?
Hi, yeah, I'm Luís Filipe. I'm teaching, well, sorry, I went to high school at Central Technical School, which is actually where I currently am teaching, though not at Central Tech, but Bloor Collegiate, which is sharing a building with Central Tech while our new building's finished. So it's been a bit of an interesting last couple of years, kind of reacquainting myself with my high school surroundings. I was back in when it was 5 years before the double cohort came in. I'm in my 17th year right now, my 8th year at Bloor Collegiate as Department of Social Science. And I've been teaching law for the last 8 years as well. It really started when I was at Bloor and the year before at Kipling Collegiate.
Amazing. So let's go over what drew you to actually teaching law in high school. Was it always something you wanted to do? Luís, how about we go back to you first?
I think to some extent it was. A lot of my sort of people I looked up to, my little celebrities in life, were my actual high school teachers. And they were, in many ways, I went to a public high school and coming from the Catholic elementary board, so they were kind of a conduit to a different culture and part of Canada that I didn't really have experience with. And so in a lot of ways, they introduced me to ideas that I had never really come across before in my life, either with family or school. So they were kind of these sort of pillars for me, just of knowledge, of information. Some of the teachers I can remember the most, I didn't learn a single thing in their class about the subject area. I just learned about life and politics and society. So it was pretty foundational. I think in a lot of ways, my students often ask me why I didn't become a lawyer. Um, and my family, there's a lot of pressure to get sort of a stable job with as minimal amount of education as possible. And so teaching was one of those opportunities that gave me, I think, a creative outlet, but also kind of got my foot in the door to kind of establishing ourselves in Canadian society. And I always joke my kids can become the lawyers if they so choose. But yeah.
Amazing. Marija, how about you?
I think similar to Luís, I definitely had quite a few influential educators in my own life that made the idea of pursuing a career in education something that I began to consider. To be honest, when I went to university, I was actually interested in pursuing law. And I actually began tutoring with the Working Women Community Center in Toronto. And this On Your Mark tutoring program really gave me an opportunity to work with students more closely, I guess I would say. And that really opened up the desire even further to pursue a career in education, and kind of went back and forth for a while in terms of whether I wanted to continue with my initial plans of pursuing law or moving into education. But I guess I shifted into the best of both worlds. I got my teaching license, and then I got to teach law to high school students. So I think definitely having the experiences that I did as a student myself gave me the desire to see what it could be like, but also at the same time recognizing I kind of kept things open, at least moving into university.
And Matt, how about you?
So teaching was really not something that was on my radar very early on. So when I was at Trudeau, I had taken the grade 11 and the grade 12 law classes, and I thought that that was a really wonderful experience for many of the same reasons that I think students today connect to the law classes in terms of the practical opportunities to engage with the work that lawyers do and thinking deeply about difficult and, I think, important topics that affect our society. And I actually kind of became set on law at that point as being a career. So after grade 11 and grade 12, I moved into taking a degree in law and society at York University and really enjoyed that, enjoyed the engagement with the social policy aspects of law, and decided after that that I was going to pursue law school. So I went to Osgoode Hall Law School, and I was there to do my Juris Doctor, so JD degree, and had just an absolutely wonderful time there, really learning deeply about the law and having the privilege of learning from some professors who both were such subject area experts, but really cared deeply about the students in their classes. And at that point, as many people do, I just sort of continued on down that path and ended up doing more corporate commercial facing law. So I articled it and summered at a law firm called Blaney McMurtry LLP in downtown Toronto, which is a full service law firm. Did a fair bit of corporate commercial law, as well as thinking about things like employment law and a few other sort of touches upon litigation. But back in high school, I had the opportunity to work quite a bit with youth at the city of Markham. So I was involved in summer camp management for quite a number of years there, and realized that there was something about teaching that really filled my cup and that I found satisfying in terms of the relationships that we build with youth. And sometime in law school, I'd kind of realized that I missed that work and I missed those connections and those relationships that we build with students. So while I was articling, even though I had really a wonderful time at the firm, I decided to apply for a teacher's college and make the move, and have loved it ever since. So I was very fortunate to catch on here in the Halton District School Board, where I've been teaching business as well as law. So it's really been a bit of a roundabout path for me, but it's really those relationships that drew me back into teaching and have made me pretty set on continuing that going forward.
Matt, you mentioned, for example, that the law touches on many things that affect us as a society. And teaching law in high school, I'm very curious to know, because as we know, the law encompasses a vast number of topics. There's criminal law, there's corporate law. So given the amount of content that's out there, how do you all plan and organize what you want to include in your classes? So Matt, how about we go back to you first?
I think that for us, it comes from, I would say, two main sources. I think the first source that I always prioritize is knowing the students in my classroom. So understanding what are their prior lived experiences, what are their prior interests with law, and trying to ensure that whatever curriculum structure I'm starting with is going to connect where they've been with law and ultimately to where they're going, whether it is a university or a college pathway. The second source, of course, is the Ontario curriculum. So the Ontario curriculum is very detailed in terms of what it sets out in terms of the law curriculum. And I think it does a very good job in providing a broad-based education for students. So typically in my classes, we start off with for a grade 11 class some of the legal principles as well as the structure of the legal system. So understanding foundational principles like the rule of law and early cases that allow for students to practice reading a case, understanding the facts, and analogizing a little bit. And then after that, we really try and make it practical for students. So we dive right into private law, giving the students the chance to learn about some of the nuts and bolts of contracts as well as torts, and trying to expose them to some of the law that works in the community and that lawyers work with every day. And then we move into, again, more practical topics like criminal law, human rights, employment law. And at the grade 12 level, we then move into a fairly detailed examination of constitutional law, as well as progressing later on in the course into international law. So trying to give students something solid to grasp onto as they work their way and develop, I think, the skills that lawyers need when they're out in practice, such as reading, writing, and being able to work through an argument.
Amazing. And Luís, how about you? Does your strategy kind of differ from what Matt's is?
No, I think there's probably a lot of foundational things that all three of us share in terms of our approach to things. And I think the challenge I was thinking as Matt was talking is that it's one of those courses where the world changes around us while we're teaching. And like right now I'm teaching international law, and each day I've walked in, there's a different social media post from the President of the United States that's sort of kind of upending some of the international legal order. And so trying to navigate, helping students themselves navigate that changing world along with what the curriculum kind of has set out, and trying to walk that fine line. And so it's often having to kind of look at how the news maybe intersects with what's happening uh, in the curriculum in a way that feels authentic, but also, that's not disjointed, that there is a plan. So it's trying to think of anticipating what might come up, how it might fall into sort of the curricular plan that's already there. And I think, as Matt mentioned, it's quite detailed. There's a lot there, and I think it provides a lot of opportunity for people to really reflect their interests and kind of adjust based on what the students like. I do find, though, one thing I've kept in mind a lot is trying to remind myself at different points. It's not law school, and so what the students are trying to get out of the course is not necessarily having that kind of like legal preparation. The second is, students. We talk about this a lot in our department. They very rarely remember a year from now or 2 years from now what you taught them. There's some foundational things that they'll highlight, but most often not, they remember how they felt in the class. And I think creating opportunities that allow them to apply some of those things in unique learning contexts that law allows for, so mock trials and things like that. Those are the things they remember. Seeing those arguments kind of spill out into the hallways is really nice as well. And then one of the pieces we talk a lot about is, it's easy with the content and cases and issues we highlight for them to see them as moral legal questions that they can engage with. The challenge I have is how to turn that kind of exercise into something they can then identify in their everyday life as also legal, moral questions to kind of challenge themselves with. And and that's always my goal and sort of where I see that course. Like, where am I going to end up? What does that student look like in the course that's taken this class with me? Like, what are those habits? What are those approaches to learning? What are those approaches to legal topics that I want them to have? And often, even when I give out evaluations, I make the point that, anyone I ask in your family, my family, on the street, they'll have an opinion on this case, right? Whether it be bail reform or an issue around international law, they'll have a lot to say. What I want from them is to see, a month, 2 months, 3 months worth of legal inquiry reflected in their answer. And so, that's a lot of how I kind of try to approach it. What's happening in the world? What do I want them to have at the end of the course? And then that, circus act that falls in between, trying to juggle all that together.
That's great. And Marija, how about you?
Very similar to Luís and Matt. I think a lot of the foundations really begin with knowing your students, recognizing that there may be a topic that's going to work with one group of students, and the next semester you can't cover that for a range of reasons, right? Depending on if you're the city in which you're teaching and working in has a courthouse nearby, right? We may have students that are engaging or navigating the legal justice system as well, and being mindful of the issues that are present within our community, so that as we are tackling them in our classrooms, we are not causing harm to students who may be on the receiving end of some of that information. Similarly, I have always been an individual who's really focused extensively on the skill development in the class, in particular in modern teaching. As much as it could be inaccurate. Students are Googling their content and their information every day. And I think a lot of our responsibility falls on how do we help them navigate what they are consuming online? How are they able to engage with the content, whether they're accessing it through social media, through mainstream media or other channels, but really looking at, are they able to develop good questions that are going to help them get closer to maybe the answers they're looking for. At the same time, recognizing that, non-closure is going to be a reality. But one of the things that my department has done historically with all of our kind of Canadian World Studies courses is teaching the course through those concepts of thinking and embedding content throughout knowing our curriculum, but also looking at what are we hoping our students are going to get out of this at the end of the day? How can we transfer the skills that we've developed in this course, whether it's, analyzing legal text or being able to complete a case analysis, public speaking, being able to ask and answer questions. How are we helping them develop those skills so that as they move into further social studies courses or the maths or sciences, regardless of the curricular area, that those skills and those foundation pieces can kind of be brought forward with them. But again, similar, I guess, to what, again, Luís and Matt mentioned, is really knowing your students, where are their interests. I might have students one year who are really interested in criminal law, and in other years, the focus is on international and really kind of using and leveraging those interests as a way to structure my class.
I think a lot of what you three mentioned is this idea of critical thinking and making sure that students are aware of what's happening in society and how that affects them as an individual and also as a collective. You've also mentioned, for example, that certain students might be attracted to certain types of law, and depending on the year, that might change. But have there been any topics that you all found to be most interesting for students, or topics that they had the most questions about? Matt, how about you go first?
It's a great question, Herman. And I would say the answer changes depending on the cohort. What I would say is I think that the biggest source typically that I'm seeing right now in interest is in criminal law. So there has been a very large resurgence in the number of kids that are watching true crime documentaries on places like Netflix. They're watching Suits, which is a little more of kind of the corporate commercial lifestyle there. And they're bringing all these rich and diverse interests into the classroom. So when we're able to dig into something like criminal law, I think it's satisfying because many students come in, I think, with what I would describe as a very Americanized understanding of criminal law sometimes. And I think that there's a real joy for them in being able to think about, okay, how do we filter that into a Canadian context? And how do we think about the way that things really work in my community? And I think that when students are then able to apply that in things like mock trial and other great practical opportunities, that's when they can kind of see themselves in the law a little bit more. And criminal law becomes, I think, a gateway into understanding a little bit more about society as a whole and about the legal system by turn.
And Marija, how about you?
Similar to Matt, I think it really depends on the cohort. You may have one group of students who want to pursue various subjects or topics within the criminal law. Others, maybe it's not of interest to them. Where I've kind of been in the last couple of years, international law has tended to be the greater interest, which is interesting because oftentimes looking at the curriculum, and in particular with that grade 12 course, there's so much content, it often gets difficult to get to the end of it. And I think as educators, we find that's very consistent across various subject areas. But I think for a lot of my students recently, really looking at the world around them and maybe their own experience as students, part of various diasporic communities, they've, migrated to parts of Canada locally here within where I'm situated, and, trying to make those connections to their family and friends, maybe that are continuing to be impacted by global issues. That has tended to draw the conversation quite a bit in my courses the last couple of years. But again, that's something that's very recent. Prior to that, criminal law definitely was taking center stage, I guess we could say. But I think because of the access to information on a global scale, it has provided an opportunity for students to really explore the legal justice system beyond the borders of our country, and how does that look in various parts of the world, and is there really an opportunity to have this international system to regulate behavior? So that has been something that has definitely I've noticed more consistently over the last couple of years. Will that continue as we move forward? I mean, time will tell. I know with a lot of things happening south of the border, a lot of conversations coming up, human rights law has definitely been coming back to the forefront. Um, so again, just being flexible and recognizing it may change, not even from semester to semester, but week to week, and not being rigid with our curriculum and saying we have to follow this because that's the order in which it was written, and really looking at what's going on around us and also where our students' interests are at that moment.
Right. And it seems like flexibility is very important when it comes to a high school course like law. Lewis, how about you?
Yeah, so there are what I would call a lot of the what if interests. So they're all, I think, based on criminal law kind of scenarios. Like, what if this happened? What if I did this? Or what if someone? So there's a lot of those kinds of questions that are, I think, reflective of some of the media they consume and some of the news stories that get it's their first interaction with legal questions. But I think, like Maria, the international legal issues have been the taking the biggest focus. I think a lot of geopolitical issues have erupted sort of during time I've been teaching grade 12 law. And I think students are making sense of these international institutions and maybe learning about for the first time in the course that are taking center stage in the news, or looking at what these things actually mean in terms of international enforcement versus sort of domestic laws. And I think there's always been an interest there, particularly around the issue of climate change. I think now there's sort of a convergence of international law and criminal international law in particular, where they have a lot of questions. And those are tricky to navigate because I think the other topics, there's a lot of things that students are bringing in terms of assumptions. These things are touching on bigger, wider sort of issues in the broader community. I have found the kind of moral underlying questions that we kind of try to do at the beginning of the course, they tend to come up a lot again, and sort of always fascinated by how many times students are coming back to the issue of like the trolley problem and kind of seeing bigger complex legal questions in that sort of in that way. We also have quite a number of students who are at our school for a specialized science math program, and so you know the life of an elective teacher is always trying to sell and convince students the value of their courses. And to that end, I think there's a lot of students who have a natural affinity for the sciences who have taken to things like some of the psychology of criminal law, some of the issues around sort of how moral judgments are made. That has sparked a lot of interest where they see some maybe connections between their interest in biology, interest in other sciences, and criminal law. We listened to something recently about this idea of free will, and there's like an area of like philosophy and criminal law that kind of converge to argue that everything is sort of comes down to a causal relationship, and can anyone really be held accountable for their actions? And you can only imagine the kinds of questions and shock and dismay, but also interest that was arisen for that. So I think that's also a piece that I've been noticing as well since being at the school I'm at.
Yeah, and you mentioned the what if questions. And when you talk about the law can often bring up a lot of sensitive topics or some that might be uncomfortable. So I was wondering, how do you all as teachers navigate those issues, especially with your students? And how do you approach them from a teacher's point of view? So, Maria, how about you go first?
This is definitely a difficult question that I think continues to come up, not only in law, but across various subject areas and grade levels as well. And we're seeing it a lot in history classes as well, in politics, and how to navigate this when we're engaging in conversations with, students and communities and stakeholders that have competing interests at times. It's double-sided. It's the reality of the world around us. We can't hide from these conversations, but I think it also means you need to know your students and how you can navigate those conversations. And I've been fortunate that oftentimes teaching for you, so grade 12, courses, oftentimes I've built those relationships with students from grade 9. A lot of time I've taught them across various years. You get to know your kids and their experiences and their background and how that impacts the way they see the world, and really being able to recognize that a topic that you may cover, will work with one of our groups, but it may not work another time. But also knowing that you provide students the opportunity where if that topic or that conversation is too much for them, and it may not be too much for them every day of the week, but that given day, that they have that opportunity to step away. At the same time, it's tricky, right? Because we don't want to make it where we can always step away from difficult conversations, because how do we ever navigate through the complexities of life around us if we always have an exit plan or an option? But I think setting guidelines within your classroom, and what I mean by guidelines is conversation guidelines. What does it mean to be able to have these conversations appropriately, respectfully, responsibly within our classroom, helps to eliminate some of those challenges that might come up. Again, sometimes we may have community interests that might navigate those conversations as well, and being able to work with families and broader community to see, how do we do this in a way that, upholds the dignity of our students, our families, but also being able to respond to what's going on around us. So for kind of going around back to your question, is there really a way that you can always avoid the difficulties of being uncomfortable with these topics? No. Are there ways that we can try to navigate it so our students can engage but be comfortable while engaging? Yes. Do I have the solution for you? No. But I think recognizing that it's a process. There's not one magical solution, and it may take a little bit of give and take to get there.
Right. And Matt, how about you? What are your thoughts on the issue?
It's certainly been something that's been top of mind, I think, in terms of the teachers that I've talked to, both in law, the other subject I teach business, in terms of how do we think about the connection between our subjects and the world around us. And I think that to echo Maria's point is that it starts with knowing the students in the classroom and building a strong sense of community. So teachers often talk about building community norms. And I think that this is important in terms of building a sense of mutual respect and tolerance, I think, for each other's viewpoints based on human rights and centering those first in our conversations. And I find that when I've worked with our students, they've all been wonderful in the sense that they're curious, they are eager to understand each other's viewpoints. And I think that it really becomes that process at the beginning of the semester of building that shared sense of community so that we understand how to respect each other and how to uphold human rights while we dive into some difficult issues. With that said, one of the things that I think, given as excellent advice early on is in my career was that not everything needs to be a debate. We have a choice in terms of what we open up for wide-ranging discussion in the class. And there are some topics out there that might cause harm to some of our students. And if we know our students well, we can try and think about those things ahead of time and potentially think, is there another way that we can discuss this? Is this something that is better discussed through more of students moving around and working on whiteboards? Is this something students can talk about in pairs? And I think that this has been something I've noticed has been effective because I think sometimes students come into law class with the assumption that it's going to be debate class and that it's going to be wide-ranging class-wide discussion. And there are absolutely moments where that is a wonderful thing to have happen, but not every topic is necessarily suited for that. And I think that one of the things that I think quite frequently about is what are the right topics to help us get at the law? Is there another way that we can get at a particular concept or a bit of learning for our students that is going to ultimately ensure that students feel safe in the classroom and that their identities are being affirmed? So it's an ongoing process. And I think about that quite frequently, for example, with something like our discussion on charter rights. So for example, students have questions about the framework for the rights concerning abortion, for example, in Canada. And that would be an example of a topic that I think it's settled law from the Supreme Court. And when we talk about, for example, life, liberty, and security of the person, we've had very recent cases on medical assistance in dying. So we actually spend much more of the focus on that. And through, I think, another topic that is a little bit, I think, safer perhaps in terms of ensuring that our students are not going to be harmed in terms of a conversation, then that's a topic that we can absolutely go for. So it's a lot of different things. It's tough. It's ongoing work. But I think one of the joys is being able to work with students and cultivate that thoughtfulness and mutual respect as they go through the class.
And Luís, how about you?
Yeah, it's funny hearing Matt mention debate club. I think having supervised that for a bit, I think that had an influence on me in terms of teaching law and not wanting to create some of those kinds of dichotomous discussions, that there's a lot more nuance. And I think I agree in the sense that there are some things that are just not up for debate. And I think students understand that. I think one of the greatest gifts as a teacher in the last couple of years is having Ted Lasso come out when it did. And I have this sort of framework on Ted Lasso that I promote to my students as sort of a beginning of the course where I talk about, I think everyone's probably seen the dartboard scene at this point, but the being curious and not judgmental and, wanting to really have that as a real reflex in the class. That's what we're doing when we're listening to what people are sharing, coming from a place of curiosity. That being said, there are some things that are not up for debate, and I think it's valuable to have some things like this year's Charter Challenge where the content is such that I think it would have lent itself to kind of that dichotomous debate. But I think the fact that the position students took from either respondent or repellent helped them see the nuance here. There was no question about the individual's identity. It was really about what's the appropriate legal response to what's happening. And I think things like that have helped students see that some of the debates they see maybe play out in broader society are not really reflective of what a legal debate's like and what this course is supposed to offer. Like Matt and Maria, I agree in terms of knowing your students. I think we made a very conscious choice, my partner and I, to get a job in the community that we work in. And so we know our students quite well. We know their families. I grew up in the neighborhood that I teach in. And there's a sort of a sense of like what's happening in the neighborhood, what's being discussed at home. And so I have some comfort that way. And I think the value of also being at a school for a number of years, you have relationships with students, their families, their siblings. You have a little more space to sometimes engage in some of these issues. You can kind of read the room in a different way. At the same time, the challenge of teaching mostly elective courses is that some of these kids I don't meet till they're in grade 11 or 12, and I don't know them quite well. And so just some practical things, doing some of those autobiography forms at the beginning of the course. And I've learned some really important things in terms of students identifying family members who have sought MAID, for example, and wanting some time if that's going to be discussed in class. There's no way to have that come up unless you're asking directly and having that information shared with you. So I think that's been really instructive. I also have a lot of conversations with my admin. And again, this is the value of also being in a school for a while, having that relationship, walking in there and saying, some stuff happening. I imagine this is going to filter into our classroom. I just need you to know this is happening. Not as a permission and kind of thing, but just so that everyone's on the same page and understands that. And that often these classes that we teach are kind of, it's a way of looking at what's happening, what's the pulse of the school, because they're not happening necessarily in math class or science. We can kind of have a sense of what's going on, what are students kind of wrestling with. And, I think that's really important, having those open lines of communication with your colleagues, administration or otherwise, that if things do go in a way that you're not anticipating, because that can happen in these conversations, that everyone's aware, they have your back, and that everything's being done in a supportive way for their learning. So I think those are the things that come to mind when it comes to addressing these sensitive topics.
What have you noticed in your own classrooms that you might want other teachers to know about?
I think that one of the biggest things that we think about as law teachers is the need to cater to the different pathways for students in our classes. We're an elective course. Not every student is taking this class with the intent of going to law school. And I think Luís brought that up perfectly early on, is that it's not law school. It's trying to provide students with different entry points to law. So I know that certainly what I'm keen on and what in talking with some of my colleagues we really love is we love the practical stuff. We love being able to give students opportunities with mock trial. One of the things that I am really trying to encourage other teachers to do is incorporate more mooting into the classroom. So mooting is a process of legal debate, in a sense, is that it is the process of arguing out a mock appeal. And OJEN provides some really wonderful resources in terms of its Charter Challenge materials for this. And through these discussions, we find that we're able to open up law to students from multiple pathways, because whether students are looking at trying to get some experience doing some ordered thinking, or maybe they're thinking of taking more of a paralegal or college-bound path, they're still able to find commonality with some of our learners who are in the university path, in working on a mock trial and playing out the roles of lawyers, witnesses, and perhaps doing some research on a topic there. So I think that the best advice I've been given at the end of the day is that we're focused on the students there. We're trying to ensure that they come away from the course feeling seen, and that they can pinpoint, right, that they have done something I think that is difficult. And there is a joy in doing difficult things and building that that resilience and being able to support our students as they take that on. So I've really had the pleasure of coaching mock trial for a number of years now, and to see students going out there and being able to compete against other schools through OJEN's competitions has been wonderful. But at the same time, seeing some students in, for example, our grade 11 classes who perhaps hadn't seen themselves in law before or are not really planning on continuing on with it, find that they're enjoying the mock trial process. They're enjoying getting exposure to things like moots in the grade 12. That's been really satisfying, I think, for me.
That's great. And Marija, how about you?
I think one of the most important things is we recognize that the curriculum, there's a lot of content. I mean, each of those strands in themselves could be an entire course. And I think it's important that we are reading the room, reading our students, the world around us, and don't rush the exploration of a topic or an issue simply for the sake of getting through all of the curriculum by the end of the semester. And I think really recognizing where students are at, and maybe that means we need to start with the foundations. Maybe that means that we can progress a little bit quicker. Maybe it means I need somewhere in between because my students are coming in from different entry points. It's very easy to get caught up in, I have X amount of days to get through this amount of curriculum and I need to get to the finish line. But I think we're really doing a disservice to our students if we treat our courses in that way, if we treat life in that way, because then they get into this position where they think, life is rigid. There isn't flexibility. There aren't opportunities to explore different pathways. And similarly with, post-secondary, aspirations, how many of our students have an idea by the time they're 16, 17, where they're going to be in 3-4 years? And for many of them in 3-4 years, they're nowhere where they thought they would be. And I think we need to treat our courses in a similar fashion. And that means providing different ways to understand the law, whether it is through some of that experiential learning, the mock trials, whether it's within your class or through the extracurricular regional competitions that exist across the province. I definitely think knowing your students is going to help you guide what's the most effective way to do that. And again, you may have students that are focused on becoming lawyers, and that's how we are going to structure the class to some extent, but also recognizing that there may be some students who that isn't the plan, and because of timetabling issues, the only option they had was that grade 11 law class, and now we're finding opportunities to get them interested. They're finding ways for them to buy into it, what we're selling essentially in that classroom, right? And hoping that having these elective courses, we might see them again in grade 12 because there was something in that course that drew them in, and now you've got them hooked, right? So again, being flexible, not sticking to the curriculum in the sense of you have to get through it all, and really letting your students and the world around you kind of guide how you're going to explore your program.
And Luís, how about you? Anything you want to share with other high school law teachers?
Yeah, I mean, first, I'd love to be an opportunity to have more advice shared with me from other law teachers. I don't know if Matt and Marija feel this way, but it feels like we work in silos often. And, I'm the only law teacher in my school. And, it's very rare that I get an opportunity to kind of talk to other individuals or listen to other individuals who teach law. But to that end, I agree in the sense that I think Robert Mewini, a former coordinator for social world studies at TDSB, often talked to me about the idea of thinking of the course as teaching them how to use a chainsaw, and that the skills that you're developing, they're going to be able to apply to any piece of wood later on. And you can change the case studies. There's so many things you're going to be hit with. There's not one set approach to teaching law, but if you can get them prepared to be able to approach whatever it is that comes their way, that's the goal, really. And just like I think anyone who teaches history, they know that this course gets longer and more complicated every year, regardless of the curriculum expectations changing. And to that end, my strongest advice would be you're never going to have your curriculum down, because you're going to constantly, be reading newspaper, constantly just learning. You need to be curious. You need to be looking and thinking about what has changed, what's happening, going on Supreme Court databases to read cases. Needs to be your best friend. Know some of those cases you can reference to students, because the other thing is some of those really, really keen students are going to find those cases. They're going to ask you questions. And I can tell you how many questions I've had to field about Section 7 of the Charter that I was in no way prepared to field. That really comes from just a curiosity and love for the subject area. You need to kind of be proactive in learning yourself as a teacher, because the students will be ready to go in that direction, whether you are or not.
Yeah, I can also attest to students being very proactive. I've done some workshops for OJEN in high schools, and usually we end up with a Q&A session. And the things that the students would ask me really surprised me because these were questions that had I been in their shoes, I would have like no idea about because they were asking me about the bar exam, the LSAT, and how do I best study for the LSAT, like things like these that when I was in high school, I never paid attention to. So I definitely recognize that students these days, or maybe other students my year were also like that too, and it was just me, but students are very, very proactive and they will do the research if they're curious about it. Matt, I don't know about you, but when I was in law class in high school, one of my favorite things that we ever did was going down to the courthouse in downtown Toronto. I don't know if you've also had that experience as well at Pet.
I did. It was in grade 11. So I had Mr. Logan, and I know that you had Madame Garofalo from listening to the previous podcast. So we went down to the court at 361 University Avenue downtown, and we had an opportunity to watch criminal court. And I recall being, I think, a little more focused on the Eaton Center trip that you could do for lunch afterwards at the time. But it was good. I think that the thing that I find students take away from being in court. And I've run a court field trip every year that I've been teaching law, including one next month where our students are going downtown to the Toronto Mega Court at 10 Armory, is that it's real in there. And I think that that's the thing I hear students saying is that you can feel the atmosphere and it makes things much more tangible for them in terms of the gravity of what we are dealing with. And it's I think, an experience where they're able to really see law play out in a practical context. And I think it's a real highlight for a lot of our students being able to go and walk into a court and have the benefit of seeing the way that lawyers are, operating in terms of their submissions, the way that judges, manage the courtroom. And it's a great thing. And I always love providing students with the opportunities to hear from justice professionals in the classroom. I think that one of the funny things I find is students are so eager and they have great questions. And I think that although I can attest to the experience of going through the LSAT and Osgood and all of those things with the bar exam, is that they still see me as their teacher. And it's nice to hear from someone who's currently in the profession. So any opportunities to get interaction with lawyers, being in the courts and seeing law play out in a real context is so valuable for our students.
And this all flows directly into my next question. So, Marija and Luís, from your perspective and your experiences, why should more people in the legal profession get involved with teaching or showing the ropes to high school students?
I think we forget that students are far more aware of the world around them than maybe we think a lot of the times. They're passionate, they're interested, they are, our future change makers. And I think giving students the opportunity to have those conversations with people who are in the profession will give them an opportunity to see that it isn't going to be what you see on Law and Order or on Suits. We mentioned it previously. And I think for a lot of our students, they come in thinking this is the reality. And, Matt spoke to taking students to the courthouse and making it real for them. And I think for a lot of students, it really gives them the chance to see that this is real life and it's not scripted. And the way we may see it on television or in film is not what we see in the courtroom. There's real emotions. There's people's lives that are being impacted by decisions that are being made. So I think more people need to get involved with high school students because high school students are also going to be engaging with the law in various ways, whether from a perspective of they're working in the profession or maybe they are having to navigate the legal justice system. At the same time, I think we could also learn a lot from students. We often, traditional educational practice has put the educator at the front of the room and, you are downloading this information onto your students and they are there receiving it. And I think if we shift that, we can realize that our students understand the world in the way that maybe as adults we don't necessarily see it because we haven't grown up with social media in the way they have. And I think having the opportunity for those who work in the profession to get involved with high school students, they can see what's important to them right now. How are they navigating the legal system in different ways? How are they using social media as a way to advocate for change and for community? And we can't do that if we don't engage with students. Luís spoke to, as law teachers, we're often siloed in our departments and very seldom do we get opportunities to interact with others. I think similarly, with students, we kind of put them in this category of you won't know yet until you've left high school. But they do know. And I think having opportunities where adults can help students navigate what it means to work in the legal field, but also what it means to not work in the legal field, I think is important. And you can't do that unless you're having conversations with youth and having conversations with youth before they get to the point where they're your colleagues.
Amazing. And Luís, what's your take on this?
So it's interesting when I was thinking about this question. My father was a caretaker at U of T, and more than anything else that I came across in school, it did the most to demystify post-secondary to me. Like I was on a regular basis on campus with him, doing his thing, unlocking doors, helping with, I worked sometimes in the summer and I would meet professors, I would meet instructors, I would meet people that were kind of in a different sphere of society to some great degree, and they were just people. And it was really nice to be able to kind of interact that way. And so university wasn't this kind of scary place when it came time to going there. And I think for students, it's similar. Just meeting the individuals that make up the legal system helps demystify it. I think it's a huge part of access to justice. I think seeing these people as real people. I'm often floored by whether it's clerks or judges or lawyers that have spoken about the very circuitous path that brought them to law, and like even listening to sort of Matt's journey to teaching. It's fascinating to think of these individuals as more than just their official title. That even a judge that holds sort of a very esteemed position in society has some interest outside of that, and maybe pursued things before they eventually went down that path. And so I think it does a lot to show that this is the system. I think the students often come to realize, maybe cynically, it's made of just people and they're fallible. And it's important to know that it's people trying their best to make this very human system work. And a lot of what we have in our society, a lot of the rights, freedom, sort of things that we hold dear are very vulnerable, and they're made up, kind of held together by these individuals. So I think it's important for students to see what role they have, see that they are individuals that have lives outside of their profession as well, and they care about maintaining what they do for society. And then even just from the standpoint of like, when else do you get to talk to someone like this? I mean, to Matt's point, when they go to court and see these interactions, it's probably the first time a lot of them will have an interaction with a lawyer or a judge, or if they actually themselves have some instance where they're involved in the criminal justice system. So what a great way to get them involved before that even happening, and in a different environment. It's something that is on their home turf to some degree.
Yeah, I mean, for me personally, meeting legal professionals earlier as a high school student really changed my life. Going back to that field trip to the courthouse downtown when I was in high school, I tell this story all the time, but on that trip, I met a judge with the entire class, and she basically said, if you want to be in the legal profession, do something fun for your undergrad. And she told us that she did opera singing for her undergrad, which I thought was the most cool thing I've ever heard in my life. And I don't know, like meeting her was really inspiring because I've never met an actual judge before that time. And I think hearing what she had to say to me as a student really set the course for where I wanted my own career to go. And, also being able to attend a trial afterwards, I think that really opened my eyes to what law is like in practice rather than just being in the classroom. But before we end things off, I wanted to ask you all this question because you've been teaching law to high school students for a while now, but for each of you, what have been your favorite moments being a high school law teacher? And Luís, maybe we'll go back to you first.
Sure. I think there are two things that stick out. One is when those arguments in class spill over into the hallway, or my favorite is when a mock trial of a fictional case with no stakes and no one actually going to prison or not. They're arguing in the hallway about whether that was hearsay. They're arguing whether that evidence was used correctly with each other. And there's something really, really wonderful about seeing that. And it's, some of it's predicated on them wanting to win, but it's also this idea of, they bought in, right? They were really into it and they wanted to see it play out the way they did. And that's always valuable. The other one is, this is such a niche area in high school. And I often have the pleasure of meeting kids that before they took this class, they didn't really have their place in the school. Like they weren't necessarily the athletes. They weren't excelling in the math and sciences. And this isn't even something that, came onto the radar, but something just kind of clicked. And I remember a mother at a graduation a couple of years ago, a student, like a beloved student, Margot, saying like, my kid just kind of found their place with this class. And there's something really, really inspiring about that. You never know when you're teaching them how many of these conversations are filtering in at home. Like I'm always surprised to hear that parent teacher interview, like they're arguing about this case or arguing about this trolley problem or what have you. And so it's just kind of providing a space where you don't really fit into the other pathways to some degree. You can kind of provide students with creative outlets to explore issues in a different way. It's always seeing kids find their place in this class, in this school, and then maybe changing the trajectory of their schooling after this. That's been probably my most favorite thing about teaching this subject area.
Matt, how about you?
I would echo what Luís just said, is that it's often, I think, surprising when you get those conversations with parents where you find out how much a particular field trip or a particular club, such as mock trial, meant to their student in finding their own way in class. And I often joke with some of my friends who are lawyers who have many questions, I guess, about what I do in the classroom. And I kind of joke that I feel like I'm making new favorite moments every day, in the sense that I think of today, I was doing my cafeteria supervision, and there was one of my grade 12 students from last semester who is going to be participating in a moot very soon. And she's like, Mr. Wilks, and like comes up to me, and we're talking in some detail about the King against Campbell case from the Supreme Court of Canada that she's preparing for. And I think that one of the really satisfying things that we see is students who are able to extend and reach outside of their comfort zone, wherever they're coming from in terms of their pathway, is seeing them challenge themselves and seeing themselves be able to, see themselves, I think, in the law that and the skills that we develop in class. So last semester, I remember we had our initial moots, and students tend to find these, I think, fairly intimidating at first in terms of carefully putting together arguments. And when I had the chance to act as the judge for some of these moots, I was blown away, where it was really satisfying. But the most satisfying thing was to see the confidence that these students were able to build and come away from the experience and feel like, I was successful and I was able to see myself developing skills and, progressing in whatever my journey kind of ends up being. So I think that that's really satisfying for me, is those little interactions. And I think that the joy of this job is in those relationships that you build, and the little moments where you realize that you were able to make a connection with a student. You're able to make them feel seen and heard in your classroom, and you hear that this is something that they're going to remember. And I think that's a special thing. And it's really a privilege to be able to work with really thoughtful, caring, wonderful humans in the classroom every day. And I think I'm very lucky to be able to do that.
That is absolutely incredible. And I think for me, like even when I was in my high school law class, one of the best things about the class was that it really helped me to develop my critical thinking and also be more aware of what's happening in society. Because, back in the day when I was in grade 9 or 10, I was like, oh, yeah, I am definitely going to do science, biology, chemistry, physics. And then in grade 10, I was like, yeah, this is this is not for me. Like I am having not a great time doing science, but when I found law, I was like, wow, this is great in terms of just building my confidence and helping me to engage with the things that I love, which is like reading and writing and, the news. But turning back to you, Marija, how about you? What has been most fulfilling for you as a high school law teacher?
I think what has been nice to see on my end is when students start to make the connections that maybe we don't explicitly talk about in class, where the legal system is not just about cases that we're discussing or what's happening in the courts, but there's connections to politics and economics and the social world around us. And I think when students see those overlaps, whether it's in their subject areas or just in life all around them, it's that oh my gosh moment, right? Where, hey, we talked about this in my politics class. Oftentimes, not going to lie, most of the time it's me also teaching a politics class, so they're kind of hearing it in that class as well. But we're looking at it through a different lens, and it gives them the opportunity to understand the full picture. That if you understand a topic or an issue just through one side, you don't understand the broader impact that it has, not only on you as an individual, but on society as a whole. So I think those aha moments where my students can see the political, economic, social implications of cases that we're exploring, I think that's been probably one of the most meaningful things. And, as someone who's also done mock trials with the students for quite a few years, for them to be able to take what we've been practicing in class and compete in regional competitions and then come back, 3, 4 years after they've graduated to say, that experience I had in that courtroom really helped me look at what do I want to do with my life. And maybe for some, they did pursue, the law because that's something that they wanted to do for a long time. And this just kind of solidified that. But for some kids, and equally as important, maybe it was something they realized it wasn't for them. And that's okay. I think a lot of the times we have this idea that grade 12 students, grade 11 students should have their lives figured out by the time they're 17, 18 years old. And I think the reality of it is they don't. And for many of them, they're going to change those paths partway into university or college or the workplace, depending on what their goals are. But if they can take some of those skills, those ability to collaborate with peers, to have conversations and to do that effectively, and hopefully those are the skills that they've developed in our courses. I think that for me is one of the most fulfilling parts is how can my students be, an active member of society, regardless of how that, looks for them in terms of a career side of things. But those skills that they've brought forward, and hopefully they've had fun along the way. So I would say those are probably the few things that have stood out on my end.
These are all amazing answers. And I think this also relates to my last question, which is why should students take law in high school? So, Matt, how about we go back to you first? What's your pitch?
I think oftentimes for students, the focus sometimes is on marks. And I think that one of the things that stuck with me where I had a chat when I was thinking about my 2L courses at Osgood with Professor Ben Berger there is he said it's okay to take things just because you're interested and because you like them, even if you can't figure out how it fits. And I think that what I tell students is that you're going to learn a bit about the world. You're going to learn about how things work. You're going to have an opportunity to develop some great skills in terms of reading, writing, whatever your comfort level is with those things. And you're going to have a chance to do some cool activities, different evaluations such as mock trials, moots that are going to allow you to put those skills into practice and really see right away how you're putting those skills to the test there. And I think that in speaking to students and hearing about why they recommend that friends take the course, that's what I hear the most is things like the mock trial, where students, they remember content, but they also remember how the course made them feel and how we as teachers made them feel and the relationships that we built there. So the goal for me is ensuring that students have that positive experience and can say that there was at least one thing in the course that they found that connected with them, and that years from now, when they are out as a member of the public, they can say, oh, I recall learning that in law class and things, and really feel like it was additive to their lives wherever they're going. So that's really the pitch for me there. And one of the things that I certainly felt coming away from law classes, it really made me think about things. And much like you, Herman, said, is it developed those critical thinking skills and just helped me understand my place in the world a little bit more.
And Marija, how about you?
It's funny. I had a parent a couple of years ago at parent-teacher interviews come in, and I'm thinking, okay, I've been teaching their child for a couple of years. I know them well. They don't really need to be here, but wonderful. I always like the conversation. And I remember this mom sat down and looked at me and said, I am so mad at you. And I went, okay. And she said, I am so mad because for the last 12 years, we had a plan. My son had a plan of what he wanted to pursue, and then he took your course, and now that plan has gone out the window. And so I didn't quite know how to respond at first. I was sitting there going, thank you, I guess. But I think what it helped me realize is that taking law opens up doors that maybe students didn't otherwise know existed. And again, whether it is to pursue a career as a lawyer or as a paralegal or in law enforcement, regardless of what that pathway looks like, it gives kids an opportunity to see the world in different ways how it's interconnected, how you can't look at issues in society through just a legal lens or just a political lens or a social or economic. However, I spoke to that previously, but really that it is something that has various parts to it, and all those parts need to function for, broader society to function. So at the end of the day, I think I would say students should take law because it may give you an option that you didn't know existed. And whether it's just that you've developed some skills that you didn't know that you had, and now you've got the confidence to apply them in whatever field you want to pursue. So I always think back to that parent, I don't think she was coming with the idea of, I'm mad at you, oh my gosh, my kid can't do this, is, okay, now we have other options, and now I need to help him, I guess, nurture that new passion that has come up. So at the end of the day, I think law really gives students, helps them build confidence because it challenges them in ways that maybe, other courses don't. And not that other courses aren't important, but I think the fact that it's constantly changing, and I can't go to my binder, and most of us who are in education know you have that binder that you've built throughout your career on any given day if you need to pull out a lesson, but you can't do that with law because you need to be current and aware of what's going on around you. And that's life. And for some students, maybe pursuing law in high school will help them navigate life outside of high school.
And last but not least, Luís.
So superficially, I'll tell students it's time for you to take a breath in the middle of your day when you're taking your 3 other sciences. You get to kind of use a different part of your brain. You get to engage with things that way. I'll also say, you'll be a hit at parties. You'll know all the random case law. You'll know all of the kind of minutia about the charter that you can kind of pull out when maybe the conversation is stalled a bit. But more realistically, I talk a lot about, you're going to live in the society that's being created for you. And you need to have some method of having some influence over it and having some understanding of how to maybe change things the way you want them to look at, not to be satisfied with what's been created for you. I think it's easy with the cases we look at to identify what's right, what's wrong. And I think for the students, my pitch to them is that I want you to be able to see your life through the same lens, to be able to understand sort of the consequences of choices you make, the impact on other people. And really the things that we talk about in law are really about making life better and more equitable, things that include more people. So, how is this going to impact your life? You're not going to become a lawyer necessarily, you're not going to become a judge, but how are these questions going to impact you? And I think, I've watched some and read some things from Michael Sandel, talking about, what's the right thing to do in these situations. And I think a lot of these questions are things that change you. Like once you engage in this kind of thinking, once you open that door, you can't unknow it. And I think my goal for these students is to think about, what kind of person do you want to be? And it's easy to tell ourselves who we think we are. And a course like this really helps us kind of discover what it is we want to be and what it is we need to do to be that kind of person. So that's my pitch when I talk to students. But like really, at the end of the day, it's kind of like, you're going to have a lot of fun. You're going to enjoy coming to this class. And I can say, and I'm sure Matt and Maria, there's nothing more challenging than a second semester, first period, grade 12 law class where you maybe get them until April before they check out. And this is a class you're going to want to keep coming to in May, even after you get your offers, where you're going to keep getting there on time, and that's, they're often kind of taken aback by that. But it's like, you'll know what I mean when you get there. And it's going to be a class you're going to make the extra effort to catch that Dufferin bus to be here on time.
Well, I think that's a nice place to end things off, and I want to thank each and every one of you today for joining the show. I think it was a really fun conversation, and I'm excited for people to listen to it. So thank you guys. I appreciate it. Thank you for tapping into this episode of Law Syrup. On the next episode, I am joined by my friend Dara Kuam as we explore the world of family law. Law Syrup is produced by me, Herman Wong, and the Ontario Justice Education Network. For more information and for accompanying resources, check out ojen.ca and our show notes. See you next time.